بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وأسوتنا وقدوتنا ومعلمنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهداه وبعد. This is our second lesson in Al-Athbāt wal-Fahāris. And in the previous lesson, I gave you quite a lengthy explanation about the benefit of researching later asanid and connecting our links to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Now, one point I did not mention, because this is quite detailed, and بإذن later on you'll come across this in when we explain either Manahij al-Muhaddithin or in An-Nusakh wa Taqid, which are later courses that will be taught بإذن. One of the benefits of studying Asanid is that books have riwayat. Now, what does this mean? So, the nature of how our books were passed on um, Islamically was that an author, he writes a book, but that's not sufficient for a book to be passed on. The author merely writing the book, and this is why the Islamic Turath and our tradition is much more detailed than the traditions of other cultures. It wasn't sufficient to merely write a book. Why? You have to understand that writing a book at that time, you're writing on manuscripts. You are writing a manuscript. And so there's a lot of room for error, and we're going to see this today, bi'idhnillah. There's a lot of room for error that can enter into those books if you were simply to pass these books on. Now, this was a valid method, according to certain mashayikh. This was a valid method of passing on your teachings. It's called munawala, all right, where you basically have a manuscript and you give it to a student. You say you give this manuscript to the student and you give ijazah with it. This is a valid method. However, obviously, it's not as good as the student actually hearing the entire book or reading the entire book upon the teacher. Regardless, munawala was found within some of the earlier mashayikh, and we'll touch upon this briefly, bi'idhnillah. However, majority of books were not restricted to munawala. The method of passing this on to one student was not restricted to munawala. Rather, the student would come and he would read the entire book upon the teacher. He would first transcribe it, or he'd buy a transcription, and then he would read the entire book upon the teacher. And anytime there was a mistake in his transcript, his manuscript, or as he was reading, the teacher corrected him based off of his own manuscript, based on what he heard from his teachers, he would correct this on his manuscript. And this would be referred to as muqabala. Either the teacher corrects, or you take the manuscript of the teacher and you use this manuscript of the teacher to correct your own manuscript. Through this method, number one, every student's manuscript is valid. And number two, every student takes the book directly from the teacher. Now, I've mentioned to you there's other methods as well, but this was the strongest method. As a result of this, you have many books, Al-Bukhari, Abu Dawood, etc., where you have multiple students in different time periods taking from the teacher. And because the teacher is always changing and editing his books, you'll find that oftentimes certain students will have certain additions that other students don't have. Or perhaps certain students will have certain remarks which other students don't have. So I'll give you an interesting example. When you come across in Mustalah, when you study Mustalah, you'll come across a discussion called Sukut Abi Dawood. Does the silence of Abu Dawood upon a hadith indicate that that hadith is Hasan lil-ihtijaj? Okay, or is it Salih lil-i'tibar? There's a long discussion here. Ibn Kathir in the Ikhtisar Ulum al-Hadith, which is a book you should all have in your pockets when you're studying, not necessarily in your pockets, you should be referring back to it when you're studying Tadrib. It's a Mukhtasar of Ibn Salah's Muqaddimah. Over there, he writes that this is true. Like Abu Dawud did say, like if I mention a hadith and I have sukut upon it, it's salih. However, he says that there are so many different riwayat of the book of Abu Dawud that sometimes we find that in certain ahadith, Abu Dawud makes a remark which he mentions to certain students, and those very same ahadith are with other students without that remark. So to actually determine if Abu Dawud has sukut, you need to look into these different manuscripts and these different riwayat. Only then can you determine whether Abu Dawud had sukut or not. And obviously this makes a big difference, because I'll give you one practical example. The hadith of Qullatayn. The hadith of Qullatayn, famous discussion in fiqh between the Shafi'iyya and the Hanabila and the Maliki and the Hanafiya with regards to al-ma'ul qalil, al-ma'ul kathir, etc., etc. There's a quite long discussion. We've discussed this in Quduri and other courses. The point over here is this. The hadith of Qullatayn, some of the Hanafiya, when trying to explain the weakness of this hadith, they say that this hadith, Abu Dawood did jarh of it. Abu Dawood referred to it as weak. And fi'lan, there are many mashayikh who do believe the hadith to be weak. There are many other mashayikh who believe the hadith to be strong. The question now comes down to, what did Abu Dawood say? So in Al-Hidayah, in an earlier books, they say Abu Dawood said it's weak. When you open the manuscripts of Al-Hidayah or the printed editions, we don't find any remark of Abu Dawood. So now it went from being weak to Abu Dawood being sakit upon it. He's quiet upon it. And that's a strong qareen and that is good to go. Again, there's a lot of discussion on this in Mustalah. What does Abu Dawood mean? So the Hanafi over here, they say that, yeah, maybe in these riwayat, there's no kalam of Abu Dawood, but perhaps Al-Hidayah, Al-Babirti, these other mashayikh, they had access to other riwayat in which Abu Dawud did have kalam on this hadith. And this is not merely a far-fetched possibility, but this generally happens in Abu Dawud. The reason I'm mentioning this is to help you understand the importance of riwayat. Alright, when we read books, sama'an upon our teachers, our chains will go up through a specific riwayah. Our chains will go up through a specific riwayah. And on account of that, there may be differences in certain riwayat which are not found in other riwayat. Okay, and to give you another practical example, if you look at Ibn Hajar's Fath al-Bari, Ibn Hajar, he wrote his commentary based on the riwayah of Abu Dhar al-Harawi, who's a very big name when it comes to Bukhari. Perhaps at a later time, if I have time, I'll explain this inshallah. He wrote his riwayah based on his commentary based on the riwayah of Abu Dhar al-Harawi. Okay, if he's writing his commentary based on the riwayah of Abu Dhar al-Harawi, the matan has to be written in a very specific manner, which is in accordance to Abu Dhar al-Harawi's recension of that book. But oftentimes you find that the printed editions of Ibn Hajar, they use a different riwayah. So, tab'an, of course, that would result in certain issues in certain areas. Now, when I say different riwayah, don't think that it's a completely different book. It's not a completely different book. What you're thinking in mind is that this must be a completely different book, it's not a completely different book. The books are the exact same, but there's certain very small, subtle differences. Sometimes in the chapter headings, a certain riwayah will have an excess amount which other riwayah don't have. Sometimes, for instance, in terms of hadith, like a word will be written, and one riwayah will narrate it in a certain manner, and the other riwayah will narrate a synonym of that word. So they mean the same thing technically, but it's just different usages. Like for instance, I'll give you one example. The hadith of Bukhari, Az-Zuhri, فَكَانَ يَتَحَنَّثُ فِيهِ. That's one method. And one method is كَانَ يَتَحَنَّفُ فِيهِ. Meaning-wise, it's the same thing. It's going to be interpreted to mean the same thing. And the words to begin with have very similar meanings. But the point is, based on different riwayat, you might have different recensions of certain words. And of course, the strongest scholar is the one who's, when teaching these books, he's able to understand that because I'm teaching according to this sanad, according to this riwayah, I will pinpoint exactly what this riwayah entails. And this plays a big role in Muwatta. Perhaps when we cover Muwatta, inshallah, I'll show you a few examples of this. Alright. This is a very important benefit of understanding our chains up until the authors of these books. And obviously, if you don't know your chains up until the authors of these books, you wouldn't be able to tell which riwayah you're reading this book according to. And oftentimes, this wouldn't result in a big issue. The practical issues that I mentioned to you earlier, in terms of commentaries being written on a certain riwayat, and the matan in the actual book is written based on different riwayah. Or the actual issue, for instance, would be when it comes to Abu Dawud doing sukut, for instance. These are practical issues which actually have practical results. As far as reciting upon a teacher is concerned, if he gives ijazah at the end, then even if you were reading from a different nuskha, different riwayah, it's not a big issue. It is not a big issue. Alright. The scholars of Mustalah have discussed طرق التلقي, طرق التحمل والتلقي in detail. What is تحمل and تلقي? تحمل and تلقي is how you are able to take a book and a hadith from your teacher. Alright? And how you're able to do ada and pass that on to other students. This is طرق التحمل, and then later on al-ada. Of course, there are conditions in this, important conditions, that are laid out by these scholars. Before I continue, just keep one thing in mind, that this, in the earlier stages, in the earlier generations, this was extremely important because as I've mentioned to you, books were not printed. So at that time, the conditions regarding this were very strict. And then later on, there was a degree of leniency. And you're going to see this in the lesson today, bi'idhnillah. In terms of taking a book from one's teacher, there's many different ways. The best way would either be to read that book upon your teacher or to hear him read it upon you. So you read the entire book upon your teacher, or he reads the entire book upon you, and then he gives you ijazah as well. He gives you permission to narrate that book from him. Okay? And this is the best method. Especially, even today it's the best method, but especially for the earlier mutaqaddimun, it was extremely crucial. Why? Because you have to understand that earlier nusakh, when they were written, manuscripts, they did not have dots. Sometimes these manuscripts did not have harakat. There was no dabt of asma, for instance. Okay? So there was a lot of room to make error. So if you simply hand someone a manuscript and say, I give you ijazah to narrate this book from me, it's possible he goes back, if he's a very bright student, he'll be able to narrate accurately. If you remember in Takween, we covered a student of Az-Zuhri, where Ali ibn Madini says regarding him that his ahadith, even though it's through munawala, لكن يقارب طلاب الزهري. His ahadith are still in line with the other students of Az-Zuhri. So even though his narrations are through munawala, where he was given a nuskha and he was given ijazah on that nuskha, without actually reading or hearing that upon the teacher. This is the method of tahammul. But because he was so bright and understanding of Az-Zuhri's ahadith, he was able to narrate those ahadith correctly. But then you'll have other students who will make mistakes. And this is an example from Imam Muslim. He brings this in the Tamyiz, his amazing book on the Ilal. He says that وَمِن فَاحِشِ الْوَهْمِ لِبْنِ لَهِيعَةٍ. He's discussing the Rawi ibn Lahi'a, famous Rawi. You can look into his biography in Tahdhib al-Tahdhib as well as Tahdhib al-Kamal, etc. Ibn Lahi'a, in his narration, he says, كَتَبَ إِلَيَّ مُوسَى بْنُ عُقْبَةَ. Musa ibn Uqba wrote to me, saying, حدثني بسر بن سعيد. Busr bin Sa'id narrates from Zayd bin Thabit that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم احتجم في المسجد. Now, what does احتجم mean? All right, keep that in mind. He did hijama in the masjid. So obviously there's going to be blood falling around. So someone asked, Masjid fi baytihi? Like, are you speaking about like the place you used to pray at home? He's like, no, Masjidur Rasuli sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Now Muslim takes this narration. Notice who is Ibn Lahi'a narrating from. Ibn Lahi'a is narrating from Musa bin Uqba. So Musa is the madar. We've mentioned exactly what madar means previously in Takween. Musa is the madar of this narration. The ruwat will differ from him. Muslim says, وَهَذِهِ رِوَايَةٌ فَاسِدَةٌ من كل جهة فاحش خطأها في المتن والإسناد جميعا وابن لهيعة المصحف في متن المغفل في إسناده. There are multiple mistakes in this narration, and the one who made this mistake is none other than Ibn Lahi'a in the sanad and in the matan of this hadith. We're going to focus on the matan over here. وإنما الحديث أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم احتجر في المسجد. The actual narration is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam ihtajara. What does ihtajara mean? أخذ حجرة. اتخذ حجرة. He had a room. He made a portion allocated to himself, a room in the masjid where he would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he narrates from حدثني محمد بن حاتم قال حدثنا بهز بن أسد قال حدثنا وهيب. And Bukhari also narrates from this طريق قال حدثني موسى بن عقبة. So notice over here the madar is Musa ibn Uqba. Wahib is narrating from him. قال سمعت أبا النضر. This is the mistake in the chain, by the way, which was made by Ibn Lahi'a. Ibn Lahi'a said from Musa ibn Uqba from Busr. But there's actually a missing link in between, and that is Abu Nadr. Ibn Lahi'a missed this. He said Musa ibn Uqba directly from Busr, whereas there's a missing link, and that missing link is Abu Nadr. يحدث عن بسر بن سعيد زيد بن ثابت رضي الله تعالى عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اتخذ حجرة في المسجد. Notice this hadith clarifies what Musa bin Uqba intended. احتجر means اتخذ حجرة. So the reason he mentioned this narration is to help you understand exactly what احتجر means. اتخذ حجرة. Ibn Lahi'a in front of him had the word احتجر. But because he was reading from a manuscript, remember he says كتب إلي موسى بن عقبة. I didn't hear this directly from Musa. This was written to me. And Ibn Lahi'a, he was weak in certain aspects. For this reason, he mistakenly read this to be ihtajama. Notice how the meaning completely changed. And then Imam Muslim narrates from Musa's teacher. Why does he narrate from Musa's teacher? Because he says, look, the madar of this specific wajh is Musa bin Uqba. You have Ibn Lahi'a narrating from Musa, and you have Wahib narrating from Musa. But Musa himself narrates this hadith from Abu Nadr Salim. So if we have another student of Salim also narrating ihtajara, it becomes very clear that the correct wording is ihtajara. So to help you understand this, we have our chain over here, Abu Nadr. Alright, this is Salim. From him we have Musa. Musa bin Uqba. From Musa, one student is Ibn Lahi'a. The other student is Wahib. Alright. So far we've told you Ibn Lahi'a made a mistake. Why? Because we opened the narration of Wahib from Musa and we determined that Wahib understood the narration correctly. But to further enhance this, now we're going to mention another student from Abu Nadr himself. And that student will be Abdullah bin Sa'id. And by mentioning his narration, we'll determine without any doubt that Ibn Lahi'a did truly make a mistake. He says, حدثنا محمد بن المثنى قال حدثنا محمد بن جعفر قال حدثنا عبد الله بن سعيد قال حدثنا سالم بن أبي النضر مولى عمر بن عبيد الله عن بسر بن سعيد عن زيد بن ثابت قال احتجر. The Prophet ﷺ took a room. So notice, because Musa bin Uqba wrote this narration too, Ibn Lahi'a, he wrote ihtajara. But Musa made a mistake in understanding the text and he mistakenly read it to be ihtajama. And so the meaning changed completely. And that's why Muslim says, الرواية الصحية في هذا الحديث ما ذكرنا عن وهيب وذكرنا أي وما ذكرنا عن عبد الله بن سعيد عن بن نضر. This is the correct narration. وابن لهيعة إنما وقع في الخطأ من هذه الرواية. Why? أنه أخذ الحديث من كتاب موسى بن عقبة إليه فيما ذكر. He said كتب إليه موسى بن عقبة. وهي الآفة التي نخشى على من أخذ الحديث من الكتب من غير سماع من المحدث أو عرض عليه. This is the mistake that we fear upon those who take a hadith directly from the books without actually hearing upon their teacher or reading the narration upon him. Because if he heard the narration upon him, he'd be able to correct this. He would be certain that this is actually ihtajar, it's not ihtajama. فإذا كان أحد هذين السماع والأرض فخليق ألا يأتي صاحبه التصحيف القبيح وما أشبه ذلك من خطأ الفاحش إن شاء الله. If he either hears from the teacher or he reads upon the teacher will correct him. So there's a very low chance that he'll make a mistake in this scenario. Whereas if someone takes the book and he has ijazah, because remember, you can't narrate if you don't have ijazah to begin with. If the teacher didn't give the student ijazah to begin with, he cannot narrate. Now there's a discussion regarding munawala, which we'll come across in mustalah. The point over here is, he made a mistake over here because he misread this text. This is what Al-Dhahabi in the biography of Ibn Jurayj, perhaps I mentioned this previously. He says, وكان ابن جريج يروي الرواية بالإجازة وبالمناولة ويتوسع في ذلك ومن ثم دخل عليه الداخل في روايات الزهري لأنه حمل عنه مناولة وهذه الأشياء يدخلها التصحيف ولا سيما في ذلك العصر لم يكن حدث في الخط بعد شكل ولا نقط. Especially in that time period, because of the fact that they did not have dots and they did not have harakat written on their nusakh. There was a genuine need to hear this from your teacher. Now, regardless of this, majority of the mashayikh, they say munawala with ijazah is a valid form of talaqqi. Even in the earlier time period, they allow this. Even though they have certain kalam on this, there's quite a bit of discussion on this. But in general, they allow this. They say it's a weaker form, but it's allowed. How do you determine the mistakes? Like we did with Ibn Lahi'a. We compare his narration with other narrators. And through that, we're able to determine if he made a mistake or not. Now, in our time, this is not that necessary in the sense that, like I've mentioned, books are already printed. So today, for instance, ijazah ma'al munawala it's overlooked. It's not a big deal because the books are already printed. Despite this, however, the best method, as I mentioned to you, is still sama' or qira'a ala al-muhaddith. Like Imam Muslim mentioned, sama' wal-ard alay. They refer to ard alay as qira'a ala al-muhaddith. نعم. أي إما سماع من المحدث أو قراءة عليه. نعم. This is the best method, along with ijazah. So the question now is, if I'm hearing the book directly from my teacher, what's the point of him giving me ijazah? Naam. The reason they say we should give ijazah even after, for instance, the student hearing an entire book upon his teacher, is because the condition of sama' from those who are capable of listening is that he's paying attention and he's not occupied by anything else. This is mentioned by Al-Biqa'i in the Nukat al-Wafiyah. The condition of sama' is that he's فَكَوْنُهُ مُصْغِيًا لِلْمَسْمُوعِ غَيْرَ غَافِلٍ. He should be paying attention. مُصْغِيًا literally means leaning. غَيْرَ غَافِلٍ, he should not be occupied ولا مشتغل بشيء by anything else. If you have a book that's 5 pages long, this is easy. If you have a book that's read in one majlis, it's not that difficult. If you have a book like Bukhari that's 9,000 or 7,000 ahadith long, a book like Muslim, a book like Abu Dawood, which is 5 volumes long, a book like Tirmidhi, it's very difficult to maintain the highest level of sama' over a course of, for instance, 80 majalis. So the nature of this is that a person will be listening, and obviously will be listening attentively, but from time to time, he will possibly zone out. From time to time, he will lose place to where they're reading. Perhaps he'll start looking into something else. Perhaps he'll become occupied with reading the hashi and he'll zone out. He won't actually be hearing, but he's still there in the majlis. So for this reason, we need ijazah to fix any possible khalal, any possible weakness in the sama'. And this is why Al-Iraqi says, وَيَنْبَغِي لِشَيْخِ أَنْ يُجِيزَ مَعْ إِسْمَاعِهِ جَبْرًا لِنَقْصٍ إِنْ وَقَعَ قال ابن عتاب ولا غنى عن إجازة مع السماع تقرن. He says that it's better for the shaykh that along with isma', along with reading or listening from his two students, he also gives them ijazah, جبرًا لنقصٍ, to fix any mistake in waqa, if there's any form of ghafla or a lack of attention from the students. Ibn Attab goes ahead to say, وَلَا غِنَى عَنْ إِجَازَةٍ, that you need to have sama' coupled with ijazah, especially in the later generations. We're not accustomed to hearing books cover to cover in long majalis. Okay? And this is why Sakhawi says, وَيَنْبَغِي عَلَى وَجْهِ الْإِسْتِحْبَابِ حَيْثُ لَمْ يَنْفَكَّ الْأَمْرُ غَالِبًا. Okay, or لم ينفك الأمر غالبا عن أحد أمور، إما خلل في الإعراب أو في الرجال أو هذرمة أو هينمة أو كلام يسير أو نعاس خفيف أو بعد أو غير ذلك. There's always going to be some sort of issues when you're listening. نعم. So that's why it's better for the teacher who's teaching to, along with reading the book upon the student, or along with hearing the book from the students, he also gives them ijazah جبرا لنقص يصحب السماع, in order to correct any hindrance that may have taken place during the sama'. All right. And this is why Ibn Salah, he had once said, as he gave ijazah to certain students who heard Bukhari from him, he said that وَأَجَزْتُ لَهُ رِوَايَتَهُ عَنِّي مُخَصَّصًا مِنْهُ بِالْإِجَازَةِ مَا زَلَّ عَنِ السَّمْعِ لِغَفْلَةٍ أو سقط عند السماع بسبب من الأسباب. I've given him ijazah specifically for those areas where, for instance, he might have been he might not have been paying attention, or he might not have heard properly, whatever the reason may be. And I'm giving him ijazah for that. And this is what Ibn Attab, Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Judhami, passed away in the year 462. He would actually say that it's required to give ijazah along with sama', because oftentimes it's very rare that a student will not be, or the student will be able to pay attention to the entire lesson in its entirety. Okay? Nah. You perhaps look into the biography of this person. Very interesting. Sakhawi mentions a very interesting story from him regarding fatawa, because that's not the main point of our lesson. We'll just read ahead bi'idhnillah. Then Sakhawi goes on to say that along with this, it's also good. ثم على كاتب الطبقة استحبابا التنبيه على ما وقع من إجازة المسمع فيها. It's good for the person who's writing the tabaqa. What is tabaqa? Tabaqa is something they call tibaq al-sama'. Essentially, if you ever look into manuscripts of hadith books, and I told you this is the beauty of our tradition, towards the end, you're going to find tibaq al-sama'. Tibaq al-sama' essentially is where they write the name of the teacher, they write the name of the student, they write the name of the writer, they write the name of the reader, and they write the name of every single person who attended that majlis. And that's why tibaq al-sama' sometimes go on for many, many pages. Okay? And obviously there's a lot of benefits in this, because you're recording every single person, and they don't just record. If someone was sleeping, they'd say he was falling asleep. If someone was 2 years old, they'll say he was 2 years old. If someone was not paying attention, they'll say he wasn't paying attention. So they record everything. All of this is mentioned in Tibaq as-Sama'. And As-Sakhawi says it's really good to actually write this towards the end. And he says the first person to do this was Taqiyuddin Abu Tahir Ismail ibn Abdullah al-Malti, who passed away in the year 619. And then he says that because certain people did not do this, because certain people did not make a point of doing this, writing who was giving ijazah, who gave ijazah, who exactly was present in the majlis, فلقد انقطعت بسبب إهمال ذلك وتركه بعض البلاد رواية بعض الكتب لكون راويها كان قد فاته ذلك ولم يوجد في الطبقة إجازة المسمع للسامعين فما أمكن قراءة ذلك الفوت عليه بالإجازة لعدم تحققها. Alright, he says you have certain books where the entire book will be narrated through sama', but because there's a small portion where there's faut, there's a small portion where there is faut in that book. And because the Katib al-Tabaqa, he did not write that the teacher after teaching the book also gave ijazah. Right, طرق التحمل, we have multiple ways, right? One is sama', one is ijazah. Ijazah is a method of tahammul. If I permit you to narrate my ahadith or my books, I've given you ijazah. You can go on and narrate these books from me. Tamam. One mistake or one issue that arose was that certain mashayikh, they heard a book in its entirety upon a teacher, but they missed a few pages, for instance. Now, those few pages they missed, if they were given ijazah for the entire book, then it would be very simple. Because the moment they were given ijazah for the entire book, we'd say that even though he missed a few pages, he narrates what he narrates through sama' and ijazah, and then the part he missed sama' in, he narrates that portion through ijazah. But if the Katib al-Tabaqa did not write to begin with that the so-and-so sheikh gave ijazah, now we can determine in that small portion, does he have ijazah, did he hear it or not? And because we can determine this for all later tabaqat in terms of that pathway, there will be a khalil in those amount of narrations. Okay? And he mentions an example of Ali ibn Nasrullah ibn Sawaf al-Shatibi and Nasai Sunan al-Sughra. Right? This is one of the narrators who narrated Sunan al-Nasai, but because when he heard the book from his teacher, he had thought in a certain issue. And the Katib al-Tabaqa did not write that the teacher gave ijazah. When they went on to hear from that teacher, they heard Nasai, but then said, wait a minute, from so-and-so hadith to so-and-so hadith, he has faut. We don't know if he has ijazah. We don't know if he heard these hadith, or he's telling us he didn't hear these hadith. So can he narrate these narrations from his teacher? No. Turuq al-Tahammul is not found. And because he can't narrate these narrations from his teacher, we can't take these from him. So they only listen to the portion لم يأخذوا عنه سوى مسموعه عنه or سوى مسموعه منه. They only listen to the portion which he heard upon Ibn Baqah, on account of the fact that no ijazah was written, so they couldn't determine whether he had a valid method of at-tahammul in those specific narrations. Alright? And on the other hand, if you look at Sahih Muslim, you'll find that in the chains of Sahih Muslim, one of the earlier narrators, one of the earliest narrators of Sahih Muslim, the student of Imam Muslim himself, he has 3 portions in the book where he does not have sama'. If you open Siyanat Sahih Muslim Ibn Salah or the Muqaddimah of Nawawi, right, they'll tell you that the earliest narrator of Sahih Muslim, through whom the book has come down to us, there are about 3 portions in the book where he does not have sama'. However, he has ijazah. He doesn't have sama', but he does have ijazah. So from the turuq of tahammul, a method of tahammul is found. And because a method of tahammul is found, you'll find that up till today, everyone narrates Sahih Muslim through that pathway, and you narrate the entire book, not just a portion, because he has sama' and ijazah in majority of the book, and in the small portion where he didn't have sama', he at least has ijazah. So that's sufficient as a method of tahammul, and the book has come down to us through ijazah. Naam. There's a lot more benefits which As-Sakhawi mentions. But one important point from over here is what we mentioned, we're in Tibaq was-Sama'. And this will come later on, when I mentioned to you the masadir of where exactly you will find a nas that so-and-so shaykh heard from so-and-so shaykh, or so-and-so heard this portion of a book from so-and-so person, etc., etc. This will all come later on, bi'idhnillah. Then you have another method, which is you hear the book in its entirety, or you read the book in its entirety, but you're not given ijazah. Now earlier on, this was more prevalent, because if you heard the book You don't need ijazah, you're paying attention. Like, as we mentioned by Ibn Attab, especially in this generation and later on, it's extremely important. It was extremely important to give ijazah along with sama' in case the rawi, for instance, wasn't paying attention, in case he dozed off, in case, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Then you have qira'ah or sama' of some portion of the book along with ijazah. Right, this is what I mentioned to you with regards to the student of Al-Imam Muslim. In the scenario where you have sama' of some portion of the book, even if it's majority of the book, and the remaining portion of the book, there's faut, he didn't hear upon his teacher, and along with that, there's no ijazah. The teacher did not give him ijazah to narrate the entire book or to narrate his narrations in general. Now, whenever you're giving ijazah and you're passing on this specific pathway, you have to specify the amount that was heard upon the teacher. This is what we mentioned to you previously by from Sakhawi's kalam with regards to Ali ibn Nasrillah and his retention of Sunan al-Nasai al-Sughra from Ibn Baqa. Because there's a certain portion in which we don't know if he was giving ijazah or not, and he didn't hear this upon his teacher. The students who narrated from him only narrate the portion which he heard from his teacher. If he was giving ijazah of the entire book or of all the narrations of his teacher, then it's very simple and very easy. Then there's no issue. But in the scenario, he was not giving ijazah, now we were into an issue. This is why Abdul Hayy al-Kattani, when he discusses the asanid leading up to many of the great shuyukh in the Maghariba, he says there's a certain issue. He says ذلك لأن مدار أسانيد أهل المغرب على الشيخ التاودي ولكن كثيرا ما يروون عنه الكتاب الذي لم يسمعوه عليه بتمامه مع أن الرواية بالسماع الذي لا يقترن بالإجازة الجابرة لما لم يسمع غرور وتدليس ولما لم يسمع غرور وتدليس فوصل الإسناد بما ذكر مجرد كذب. Why? Because he says you read a portion of a book upon your teacher, and if, assuming the teacher did not give ijazah for the remainder of that book, when you pass this narration on and your student asks you, who did you hear from? You say, I read upon so-and-so teacher. So you're like, oh, this is an amazing sentence. You read upon that teacher. You're unaware of the fact, like the grad student is unaware of the fact that the student didn't actually hear the entire book. He only heard a portion. And in the remaining portion, he does not have ijazah. So this is ghurur and tadlis. Right? It's deception. And connecting the sanad through this method is mujarrad kadhib. Remember I told you the ulama and the muhaddithun are extremely critical and extremely precise in these matters. We're talking about Abdul Hayy al-Kattani, who passed away just a few centuries ago. We'll mention him bi'idhnillah soon. Okay? In his time, he's saying that we have to be very careful of this. After all the books have already been written. So this shows you the level of accuracy and precision which the mashayikh would have when retaining their books from their teachers. Okay? Nah. And then he mentions the issues which he said he's seen in many of the asanid of Ahl al-Maghrib, that they haven't taken the entire book and they don't have ijazah in the remaining part of the book, but despite that they still go ahead and they narrate the entire book. Then he says نعم من حقق سماعه لجميع كتاب or من حقق سماعه لجميع كتاب على شيخه بحيث لم يفته من شيء. As for that person who has the sama of the entirety of the book and nothing missed him, أو له منه إجازة جابرة ما لا إجازة جابرة ما لعله لم يسمع, or he has an ijazah which fixes, which corrects that which possibly he has not heard. فروايته صحيحة, this is a valid chain, وإسناده معتبر خصوصا مع اتحاد النسخ, especially when the نسخة is the same with رواية, أما مع اختلافها وتباين رواياتها وانعدام الإجازة العامة فلا. This is what I mentioned to you earlier on as well. If you have different nusakh and you don't have ijazah to make up for those different nusakh, then there is room for يعني nazar in that narration. Because I mentioned to you that nusakh differ, and on account of nusakh differing, you should give ijazah towards the end of sama' in order to ensure to make up for all the different nusakh in that book specifically. Okay? And he mentions a very interesting point on subhanAllah. He says that we've seen certain mashayikh, what do? They go to the bookstore, they buy a certain manuscript, and they come and they start teaching that manuscript from their teacher. Okay. The manuscript they have is based on the Nusakh al-Qastallani. Qastallani is the commentator on Bukhari, on Irshad al-Sari. Al-Qastallani relied upon the Nusakh of Junini. Yunini relied upon the Nusqa of As-Sarakhsi. Like his chain goes through As-Sarakhsi, Ibn Hummayy As-Sarakhsi. His teacher who narrates the book is narrating from the path of Ibn Sa'ada, whose chain goes up to Abu Dhar al-Harawi. So there's different recensions of the book. And because the person hasn't studied this, he does not realize that he's narrating through the Nuskha of Al-Qastallani, saying, I heard this from my teacher, even though what he heard from his teacher with a different Nuskha altogether. Okay? And of course, generally speaking, people won't be aware of this, but the Mashayikh who are aware of As-Sama' etc., and these Daqa'iq, they're aware of these intricate details. The Nuskha of Ibn Sa'ada and Yunini, perhaps we'll cover it later on, bi'idhnillah. Maybe in Nusakh, depending on if you choose Bukhari, if you choose to research Bukhari at that point. Or perhaps you'll come across it in later classes. All right. Then you have Ijazah Mahda. I give, for instance, someone Ijazah to narrate so and so specific book from me. All right. And this was also there. ثم الإجازة تلي السماع. Ijazah was found. Now there's khilaf in the Mashayikh. Is Ijazah stronger or is Sama' stronger? But towards the end, As-Sakhawi writes that وَالْحَقُّ أَنَّ الْإِجَازَةَ دُونَ السَّمَاع. That Ijazah is not on the same level as Sama'. Rather, Sama' is better لأنه أبعد أن التصحيف والتحريف. Because there's a lower chance of any mistakes occurring in when you hear the book directly upon your teacher. Even till today, they give preference to Sama' over Ijazah. But certain mutaakhirun give preference to Ijazah over Sama' because they say merely hearing a book doesn't mean anything. This is the view of certain mashayikh, which is not taken generally in the books of it's not taken generally when it comes to those who are engaged in the sanid. But it needs to be mentioned. It's not fair to act as if there's no second opinion that Ijazah in these later centuries is not better than Sama'. Why do they say Ijazah is later than Sama'? Because they say that, look, the purpose over here is turuqut tahammul. Are you able to retain this book from your teacher and pass it on? In the earlier centuries, there was a genuine need for Sama'. Because if you didn't hear the book from your teacher, there's a high chance you're making a mistake in the method that you're hearing it, or in the method that you're passing it on. You might make a mistake in wording, you might make a mistake in the name of a rawi, etc., etc. But today we have commentaries, and these commentaries explain everything to us that's within the book. And then these books themselves are printed. So if these books themselves are printed, then instead of a person, for instance, listening a book upon a teacher who's not going to correct anything, who's not going to fix dabt of any asma, who's not going to fix any of the mistakes the reciter might be making, and there's a lot of mistakes reciters make, even from printed books, because printed books also have mistakes in them. Okay? And again, when I'm referring to mistakes, I'll just mention this again. When we say, for instance, the printed edition of Bukhari has a mistake, don't think that there's like a hadith missing or like there's a serious mistake which is going to result in the Sahih not being Sahih anymore. That's not what we refer to as mistakes. We're referring to very specific, precise details. Like someone might recite the name of a rawi incorrectly. Someone might, for instance, recite a word incorrectly. In the Shama'il, towards the end of Shama'il, there's a hadith in which there's a wording ثُمَّ مَالَ فَمَاتَ. But in certain nusakh, you have ثُمَّ بَالَ فَمَاتَ. Both meanings are established in other narrations. But what did Tirmidhi narrate? Someone might make a mistake in understanding that. Very specific details is what we're referring to. We're not saying that they're going to miss out a portion of the hadith altogether, or that when we say the matbu'ah has a mistake, that they've added something into the edition of the book. That's not what we're referring to. We're referring to very specific mistakes, and we'll cover this bi'idhnillah later on in a nusakh wa taqid. Regardless, this is the view of certain mashayikh, and you'll find mention of this in Az-Zarkashi's Nukat. He quotes this from At-Tufi. He says, At-Tufi was of the opinion, the great usuli, that in this later century, Ijazah is better than Sama'. And I believe As-Sakhawi indicates this. As-Sakhawi says over here that he mentions it for certain mutaakhirun. I don't think he mentioned his name, but perhaps he meant to indicate At-Tufi. نعم. وخص بعضهم الاستواء بالأزمان المستمر. This over here, this seems to be referring to At-Tufi based on what Az-Zarkashi quoted from him in the Nukat. Regardless, you can refer back to Az-Zarkashi's Nukat. This is the view. The detailed view is that Sama' is better, especially if the teacher is correcting these mistakes and fixing these marwiyat. If the teacher is genuinely correcting the tab'a in front of you, there's multiple matbu'at in front of you. For instance, you're doing muqabala at the same time. Some student has a nuskha in the corner. Right? Then obviously there's a lot more benefit in this than there is in mujarrad ijazah. And when it comes to the main books, Shaykh Safwan always mentions this, when it comes to the main books of hadith, Al-Bukhari, Al-Muwatta, Sahih Muslim, etc., etc., Over here in these books, sama' is necessary. Try to make it your goal. طبعا after تمكن في العلوم, after understanding what the muhaddith is saying, etc. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, try to make it your goal to attain sama' kamil in these books along with Ijazah Jabira. Okay. Then you have, for instance, al-Ijazah al-Mahdha li jami' al-marwiyat. Previously, you mentioned Ijazah for a specific book. So I give you Ijazah to narrate, for instance, Muwatta. But then there's another method. I give you Ijazah, for instance, to narrate everything, all of my marwiyat. This spread a lot amongst the mutaakhirun. This spread quite a bit. All right. And then you have another version where you give Ijazah al-Amma li ahl asr. Like you're not giving Ijazah Amma to one person. You're saying, I allow everyone across the globe in my time period to narrate from me all of my marwiyat. And this spread a lot amongst the mutaakhirun as well. However, the earlier mashayikh are completely against this. There's a lot of strict kalam on this. Yes, certain mashayikh allowed this. Again, to be fair, certain mashayikh did allow this. But this today has led to a degree of tasahul in marwiyat, which is madhmoom. Every other person has ijazah amma from so-and-so person, to the point that, as we mentioned from Shaykh Safwan's kalam yesterday, حتى اغتر به صغار الطلبة. Like these basic students who have yet to learn Arabic, start to think of them as great scholars because they have ijazah from so and so and so and so. When it reaches this level, it's very problematic. And this is why Shaykh Safwan, he has a habit that, from what I've seen, he's never given ijazah amma, in front of me at least. He has never given ijazah amma. This is famous amongst the students, that Shaykh Safwan does not give ijazah amma. But when you read a book in its entirety, he will give you ijazah for that book. And this is a balanced method. It creates the haiba of hadith. It creates the waqar of hadith. And it allows students to get a glimpse of what our earlier mashayikh, Ibn Hajar, As-Sakhawi, Ha'ula, would do. In fact, there's a very interesting statement of Sakhawi. I'm not sure if it's in the Jawahir wa Durar or if it's in a different book. I forgot to quote it. Where he mentions that our mashayikh, we narrate everything to sama'. We try to narrate everything through sama'. We don't rely upon ijazah of amma or ijazah of Ahlul Asr. And this is the trend or the understanding we should bring forward towards these majalis as well, in order to create a balance. In order to create a balance. All right. And this is why Al-Budayri Al-Husayni Al-Dimyati, who is the teacher of Sheikh Muhammad bin Salim Al-Hifni, Sheikh Muhammad bin Ahmed Al-Dimyati, he has a very interesting thabat. It's called Al-Jawahir Al-Ghawali, Makhtuta. There's also, I think, a written out version. But in the Makhtuta, he gives ijazah to Ahlul Zaman. He gives ijazah to Ahl Zamanihi. He says, based on the earlier mashayikh, this is a later scholar, he says, based on my mashayikh who've done this, I will also give ijazah to Ahlul Zaman. But then he says, لكن شتان ما بين مجتهد وكسلان ويقظان ونومان فليس من قرأ البخاري أو سمعه كمن تلقاه كله وجمعه وليس من عليه اقتصر كمن سمع الكتب الستة وانتصر وليس من اقتصر على الستة كمن زاد عليها سماع ما يأتي بيانه البتة. Says, don't have any doubt that there's a world of a difference between that person who strives to read the books in their entirety upon their teachers, and not just Bukhari, but all the kutub upon his teachers, and that person who doesn't do this. There is a world of a difference between these people. And we'd add on that there is a world of a difference between someone who relies merely on ijazat, ajazani fulan wa allan, wa indi isnad ali fi kaza wa kaza, and someone who genuinely not just studies books inside out, but he has ilm, he has wara', he's spent time mulazim of the mashayikh, and after this he reaches the level which he reached. And when you come across the marwiyat, subhanallah, we'll find this. When you come across the marwiyat of the mashayikh, you'll find that the greatest scholars upon whom the madar of asanid were in later generations, they were all of this category. If you look at the madar of Misr, the madar of Maghrib, the madar of Sham, the madar of Hind, for instance, all these mashayikh, you'll find interestingly that within this kutub sitta, they don't actually have sama' kamil. Within one book or another, they'll have sama' li ba'd. But they still became the madar of that country, not only on account of their high asanid, but rather on account of their wara', rather on account of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choosing them, choosing to preserve their name, and on account of their ilm, which they passed on, and their ilm which has reached us generation after generation in their books, in their ta'alif. So this is where we emphasize how important it is that along with sama' and ijazat, a student also studies. Otherwise, a person will become deceived and he will begin to think of himself what he is not. All right? And in this time, seeing as the books have already been printed, along with sama' along with ijazah, we should also be given. We should also be teaching these books in their entirety. Keeping in mind that the method of dhabt has changed from time to time. And we'll quote a very interesting passage of Shah Waliullah Ad-Dihlawi with regards to this. This is the madar of Asanid of Ahlul Hind. Sheikh Shah Waliullah is the madar of Asanid al-Hind. Alright? Naam. Sheikh Shah Waliullah has multiple books on Asanid. Some of these books are in Farsi, like Insan al-Ain, for instance, in reality is a book written in Farsi, but it's been translated to Arabic. It's a good edition that's been translated. Um, he has إتحاف النبي or إتحاف الفقيه والمحدث والفقيه فيما يحتاج إليه فيما يحتاج إليه, something along these lines. إتحاف المحدث والنبي والفقيه عفوا. He mentions a few of his sanid over there. He has Al-Irshad ila Ummahat al-Isnad. We're going to quote from that as well. He mentions a few of his sanid over there as well. In Insan al-Ain, when discussing the biography of his teacher's teacher, Naam, Abdullah bin Salim al-Basri, who was the teacher of Abu Tahir al-Kurdi, who was the teacher of Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi, he says regarding Sheikh Abdullah bin Salim al-Basri that he was a hafiz. He was the hafiz of his century. And when you read Sheikh Abdullah bin Salim al-Basri's biography, you will come to agree that he was truly the hafiz of his century. You will find that Sheikh Abdullah bin Salim al-Basri, number one, he revived the recital of Musnad al-Imam Ahmad. After about 2 centuries or so of it not being recited in its entirety, he was the person who brought the nuskha of Musnad Ahmad, and it was read upon him in the Kaaba in its entirety. He has a very unique edition of Bukhari. He took the nuskha of Yunini and he added on ziyadat and he worked upon it. He has a commentary on Bukhari, not complete unfortunately. He has a hashiyah on Taqrib al-Tahdhib. So the man is a muhaddith. The man is a muhaddith and a hafiz. But now the question comes, if he is a hafiz, has he memorized, right, 2 million ahadith? So over here, Shah Waliullah says that, look, dhabt changes over time. The method of dhabt changes over time. He says, الدور الأول دور الصحابة والتابعين وكان ضبطهم هو إتقانهم في الحفظ. Because generally speaking, what was prevalent in the earlier centuries was narrating mushafahatan without books. This is what was prevalent, the prevalent method. Of course, there were books, people had scrolls. We mentioned this in detail in Takwin al-Asanid. But what was prevalent in that time was narrating from one's hifz. And if you read Min al-Nabi al-Bukhari, you'll come across a lot of examples of this. Then later on, what occurred was the general method of narrating changed to a nusakh. Meaning you're still narrating from your teacher, you're still hearing from your teacher. There's still huffaz. Al-Bayhaqi is a hafiz of hadith. Al-Tahawi is a hafiz of hadith. All of these mashayikh are huffaz. They're huffaz of hadith. But there is a strong amount of reliance on the books. And in fact, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal wouldn't narrate from his memory. He would ensure to narrate from his book, even though he is one of the greatest huffaz of all time. But to ensure, out of ihtiyat, and to ensure he narrates his narration as he received it, he would narrate from his book. There was a heavy reliance on nusakh. But now the issue with this is the nusakh themselves, they differ. And nusakh themselves, there's mistakes in them. There's tasheef. The names of certain ruwat are not codified correctly. Certain times you're missing hadith, there's saqat. So you have to do islah of these nusakh. And that's why within the books of Mustalah, you find a large portion of the books of Mustalah discussing how to do islah of nusakh. How do you fix a nuskha? How do you do muqabala, etc., etc. And if you ever look into earlier nusakh, you'll find that many of these earlier nusakh have muqabala done. There is muqabala of the teacher's nuskha that's done upon the student's nuskha in order to ensure he narrates correctly. And then along with that, the student is reading this nuskha upon his teacher. He's taking directly from his teacher. So their method of dhabt was تبيين الخط والاحتياط في النقط والحركات والسكنات والالتزام بهيئة الحروف والمقابلة بالأصول الصحيحة وحفظ الكتاب من العوارض الطارئة. This was this method of dhabt. Then later on, when the huffaz and the mashayikh, they wrote commentaries, lengthy commentaries, and they wrote books in Asma' al-Rijal, and they wrote books in the Gharib al-Hadith and Dhabt al-Kalimat, and they wrote in this in detail. Now, even if, for instance, a student doesn't take a nuskha directly from his teacher, or he doesn't have muqabala done from his teacher, he still has access to Ibn Hajar, he still has access to Al-Qadi Iyad, he still has access to An-Nawawi, to Ibn Salah, he still has access to Ibn al-Athir. He has access to these mashayikh who clarify for him how to recite the words. He has access to Al-Mizzi, he has access to Mughultai, to clarify for him how do you actually pronounce the names of ruwat, etc. etc. And because he has access to this, he is able to fix his nuskha. And that's why Shah Waliullah says فالضبط في هذه الأيام فالضبط في هذه الأيام أن تطالع الكتب والشروح ويستفاد منها. And then he explains that this is the reason why later mashayikh, they showed more leniency in certain things, whereas earlier mashayikh were more strict. I mentioned to you one example, Ijazah Amma, li Ahl al-Asr, for instance. Right? In earlier mashayikh, this was very rare, and they were heavily against it, even though you do find certain occasions where they would do this. But later on, the mashayikh became more lenient with this because you already have books fixing all these mistakes. So it's just a matter, if I can trust the student to actually research, then I can give him ijazah. Okay, now obviously I mentioned to you in this generation, this has reached another extreme, where every random person who doesn't even know how to research has ijazah. This is another extreme. Lakin at that time period, they would rely on a person's understanding and they would give him ijazah. Okay? And this is what Shah Waliullah essentially mentions. And for this reason, he says that there still remain huffaz of hadith even in our century and in our time period. However, the method of dabt changes from time to time. With this, we finish today's lesson. And from tomorrow onwards, bi'idhnillah, we'll cover exactly how or where do we find mention of turuq al-tahammul. So where do we find, for instance, that so-and-so person gave ijazah to so-and-so person? Where do we find that so-and-so person read the book in its entirety upon so-and-so person? We'll mention about 5 or 6 general masadir. And then as we go through the chains of al-shama'il bi'idhnillah, we'll be going through these masadir in detail. Now the method in which we're going to teach the chains of shama'il is that we'll mention multiple chains from Al-Abdul Faqir and Sheikh Umar as well, up until the author of Al-Shama'il al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Imam Tirmidhi. And we'll research the biographies of certain narrators. Why certain narrators? Because we can't go through every narrator in detail. There's too much information. And we only have a few lessons. But anytime there's an important narrator, we have to establish sama', or we show you the khilaf over his sama'. Why was there khilaf? How do we make sense of this khilaf? What's the correct opinion, etc., etc., for instance? Over here, we'll go into actual biographies of these narrators. And the main book we'll be relying upon is An-Nafh al-Miski of Al-Attar. An-Nafh al-Miski of Al-Attar, the great scholar of Mecca, who traveled to India, and he did tahrir of many of the asanid of Ahlul Hind. And for this specific book, Sheikh Ziyad Tukla mentions this as well, the ajwadul asanid in this specific book are the asanid of Ahlul Hind in Shama'il. And we'll see this bi'idhnillah as we go through these books. Along with this, we'll also be covering the asanid of Ahl Misr, Al-Amir al-Kabir, etc. Shanawani, as well as a few asanid of Ahl Sham, through the pathway of our beloved teacher Sheikh Safwan. These are the main asanid we're going to be focusing on. And along with this, we'll be giving you a lot of sources, resources to look back into Athbāt, Fahāris, Makhtutat, Ijazat, Tibaq al-Sama', etc., etc., to help you understand how detailed this discussion, this field can get, and to help you appreciate the work which our mashayikh and our ulama have done in preserving our chains up until the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we'll begin on this next week, bi'idhnillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.